Experts discovered an old photograph from 1871. At first, it looked ordinary, but one hidden detail completely changed what we thought we knew about the past. No one was prepared for what they uncovered. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The discovery came on an autumn afternoon when the air outside the university's brick library carried the faint scent of wet leaves and wood smoke. The archive room, far from the bustle of students, seemed untouched by time itself. Dust hung in the shafts of sunlight that cut across the high windows, and the silence was broken only by the faint hum of a climate control machine. Boxes upon boxes filled the long shelves, their labels faded or missing altogether. To the young historian who had been assigned the tedious task of cataloging forgotten donations, most of it felt lifeless, the detritus of families long gone. Old tax receipts, deeds, grocery lists, letters filled with pleasantries that no one had cared to preserve properly. And then there was the box that refused to be ordinary. It was unmarked, its cardboard fraying at the edges, the tape brittle with age. Inside, beneath layers of brittle newspapers, lay a thick stack of papers tied with a piece of twine that had long ago given up its strength. When he untangled the knot and pulled the bundle apart, a photograph slipped out and landed on the desk with a faint thud. At first glance, it seemed like one of thousands of portraits taken during the unsettled years after the Civil War. 3 men standing before a weather-beaten wooden structure, their clothes worn but sturdy, each holding a rifle in his calloused hands. Their gazes were steady, unsmiling, carrying the gravity of survival in hard times. Yet something about the image made the historian lean closer, as though some invisible thread tugged at him. He adjusted the lamp and studied the edges of the photo. The black and white tones were blurred by age, but the detail was sharper than expected, suggesting it had been captured with unusual care. The log building behind the men seemed half collapsed, weeds creeping around its foundation. The men themselves, 3 dark faces etched with both youth and weariness, stood shoulder to shoulder. They were not posing with pride, as hunters sometimes did, but with a kind of defiance, their bodies rigid, their mouths set as though daring the camera itself to judge them. And then the historian's eyes fell lower, to the ground at their feet, where a dark stain marred the dirt. It was too irregular to be shadow, too heavy to be mud. A chill ran down his spine at the thought that it might once have been blood, captured forever in the emulsion of the glass plate. Turning the photograph over, he found an inscription. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible enough to raise the hairs on his arms. Blood for blood, 1871. The handwriting was crude, hurried, as if the writer wanted to brand the image with a message but had no time for flourishes. The historian felt the weight of those words pressing on him. This was no casual family portrait, no memento of a day's hunt. Whoever had written those words wanted the image to carry a story, a warning perhaps, or a testimony. He brought the picture closer to the light and examined the weapons. The rifles were ordinary at first sight. Winchesters, the kind often found in the hands of farmers, hunters, or soldiers in the years following the war. But the stock of the gun held by the man on the left bore a curious mark. A small engraving, delicate yet unmistakable, of a torch engulfed in flames. The historian frowned, rifling through his memory. He had seen that symbol before, buried in footnotes of old research articles, half dismissed by most academics as folklore. It was said to have been the emblem of certain clandestine groups of freedmen who organized for self-defense in the violent aftermath of emancipation. groups that official history preferred to ignore, whose stories were whispered about but never fully documented. He leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. If this photo was authentic, it was not only a rare image of three black men armed and standing unflinching before a camera in 1871, but also a potential key to understanding one of the darkest and least spoken of chapters of American history. Too often, the photographs preserved from that period showed the newly freed as passive subjects, families in ragged clothes, men posed stiffly for portraits taken by white photographers who wanted to capture a sanitized image of Reconstruction. But this was different. The men in this photograph were not passive, and they were not smiling. They stood as if guarding something, or as if declaring silently that they would not bend to terror. The historian's mind began to race with possibilities. Were these men part of a documented militia? Had they left behind records in the county courthouse, or perhaps been mentioned in the angry columns of local newspapers of the era? And who had written the chilling words on the back? Was it their own hand, marking their defiance for posterity, or the scrawl of someone who had hated them and wanted to curse their memory? He carried the photograph to the scanner in the corner of the room, careful not to smudge the fragile paper. The machine hummed softly, capturing every grain of the old image into digital clarity. On the computer screen, the details became sharper still. He zoomed in on the men's faces. The oldest of them, perhaps in his late 20s, wore a hat pulled low, shadowing his eyes but not concealing their burning intensity. The middle figure, leaner, carried himself with a soldier's stiffness, his jaw clenched tight. The youngest looked no older than 20, his gaze caught between fear and fury. His lips pressed so firmly together they seemed carved from stone. As the historian studied them, he felt as if the three figures were staring back across the gulf of centuries. He imagined the moment the photograph was taken, the clumsy tripod, the long exposure, the silence required as the lens drank in the image. These men had chosen to be captured in that moment, not as victims, but as something else entirely. He thought of the blood stain at their feet and the words on the back of the photo. This was no accident. This was testimony. His thoughts drifted to the county in which the box had been found. It had a long and troubled past, marked by records of violence against freedmen in the years following the war. Stories of lynchings, of burned houses, of families driven off their land. Could these three have been among those who chose not to flee, who instead stood their ground with rifles in hand? And if so, what had become of them? The historian knew that official archives would not tell the whole truth. Court records and newspapers of the time had been written by men who wanted the memory of armed black resistance erased. That made this photograph all the more vital. It was proof that defiance had existed, captured in silver and glass. He sat back, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a notebook. He began to jot down questions. Who were these men? What was the significance of the torch symbol? Could the bloodstain be real, or was it merely an artifact of the photograph? What was happening in 1871 in this region that would compel three young black men to pose with weapons, daring history itself to remember them? The archive room felt suddenly smaller, its walls pressing in with the weight of untold stories. The young historian realized he was holding not just a photograph but a fragment of truth that had been buried for over a century. He thought of all the families who had lived and died without their stories ever being recorded, their names lost in the smoke of burned cabins and the silence of unmarked graves. Perhaps this photograph was their voice, breaking through time. He knew he could not let it rest. There would be research to do, genealogies to trace, newspapers to scour, whispers to follow into the dark corners of forgotten history. The torch carved into the rifle stock was not just decoration, it was a key, and he intended to find the lock it opened. As he carefully returned the original photo to its folder, the historian felt a shiver that was not entirely from the cool air of the archive. Something in those faces, in the words scrawled on the back, had reached across the generations to seize him. He switched off the lamp, but the image burned behind his eyes. 3 men, rifles in hand, standing firm against the tide of hatred, a dark stain at their feet, and above it all the silent vow etched in fading ink: blood for blood. The story had begun to stir. And in its stirring, the ghosts of 1871 seemed to rise from the dust, demanding to be heard. The photograph had been a door, and once opened it refused to let the young historian close it again. He carried its image with him as though it were etched into his mind, replaying every detail, every shadow, every line of the men's faces. In his notes, he had written again and again the question that gnawed at him: who were they? Days turned into weeks as he scoured old census records, fragments of church registries, yellowed newspapers that crumbled at his touch. And gradually, through scattered mentions and half-forgotten lines, 3 names began to emerge like figures stepping out of mist. They were Johnsons, sons of a man named Isaac, whose life had been marked from the beginning by chains and whose death had been written in violence. Isaac Johnson had been born into slavery on a plantation outside Augusta. Like countless others, he had survived by grit and quiet defiance, carrying scars across his back that told of lashes endured when he was still a boy. Yet the war had changed everything. When Union troops pressed south, Isaac seized the chance that freedom offered. He walked away from the plantation with nothing but the shirt on his back, and he did not look behind him. Freedom was a bitter gift. Paper promises signed in distant offices meant little in a countryside where former masters now called themselves redeemers and gathered with rifles to ensure that black men remained in fear. But Isaac had something few possessed: determination and a knack for hard work that made him indispensable to struggling white farmers who suddenly found their economy shattered. By laboring day and night, saving every coin, he managed what few dared even to dream of. He purchased a parcel of land, rocky, small, but his own. It was this act, more than any words or defiance, that sealed his fate. Land meant independence. Land meant the chance to raise sons who would not bow to any master. And land, in the eyes of his neighbors, meant that Isaac had stepped above his place. Rumors spread quickly in the county. Whispers turned to shouts in the taverns, and before long, men whose fathers had worn Confederate gray muttered that Isaac Johnson needed to be taught a lesson. His sons were still boys then, but they remembered everything. The eldest, Solomon, carried the memory of their father coming home with papers clutched in his calloused hand, his face shining with pride as he told them the land was theirs now. The middle child, David, recalled the way their mother knelt in the yard and wept with joy, pressing her forehead to the soil. And the youngest, Caleb, remembered how their father lifted him onto his shoulders and said that this dirt would one day feed them all. Those were brief days of hope, and in memory they gleamed brighter because of how swiftly darkness followed. One night in the summer of 1868, when the cicadas screamed in the trees and the air was heavy with the smell of rain, Isaac was taken. The boys had been asleep on the dirt floor when the sound of hooves shattered the silence. Their mother tried to hush them, to keep them hidden, but the shouting outside grew louder. Men hammered on the door with rifle butts, demanding Isaac come out. He stood tall, refusing at first, But when they threatened to set the cabin aflame with his children inside, he stepped forward into the night. The boys crept to the window and watched with wide eyes as their father was bound, dragged toward the grove of oaks at the edge of the field. Lanterns swung in the darkness, throwing grotesque shadows across the trees. Their mother tried to hold them back, but Solomon, oldest and already taller than his years, pulled free. He saw it all. The rope, the jeers, the way Isaac did not beg, though fists rained against his body. And then the moment when the rope snapped taut and their father's body jerked, suspended in the cruel light. They found him the next morning, the crows already gathered. Their mother's screams carried across the fields, a sound that would never leave their ears. From that day forward, the Johnson boys lived with a fire inside them that no preacher's sermon could quench. They buried their father beneath the oak, but with him they buried the last fragile belief that freedom meant safety. Grief devoured their mother. Within months, she grew pale, coughing blood into rags, her spirit broken as much as her body. She died one winter morning, her face gaunt, her hands clutching a Bible she could barely read. The brothers stood alone beside her grave, 3 boys with no family left, staring into the frozen ground that had taken both parents. They were orphans in a world that considered their lives cheap. In the years that followed, survival was brutal. They worked where they could, hauling lumber, plowing fields, mending fences, anything that might earn them scraps of food or a corner in someone's barn. They felt the weight of eyes on them wherever they went. White children spat at them in the road, grown men sneered, and sometimes stones flew when they passed. The memory of their father's murder was never far from their minds, a constant drumbeat reminding them of what awaited any black man who dared to claim dignity. Solomon grew into a man with shoulders broad as an ox, his temper quick and his fists quicker. He would not allow anyone to lay a hand on his brothers. David, leaner, carried a silence that others mistook for meekness, but when he picked up a rifle, he proved to have an eye like steel. Caleb, the youngest, absorbed everything. He carried the rage of a child who had seen too much too soon, and beneath his quiet demeanor smoldered an anger that frightened even his brothers. They clung to each other, bound not only by blood but by the shared memory of violence. Nights were the worst. The sound of horses in the distance made them stiffen, and the glow of lanterns across the hills filled them with dread. They knew that mobs still roamed, looking for excuses to terrorize. Fires often lit the horizon, smoke rising from the homes of neighbors who had dared to stand too proudly. Every day was a lesson. No law would protect them, no sheriff would come to their aid. And yet, even in this landscape of fear, there were embers of resistance. Whispers spread through the black community about men who would not bow, men who met violence with violence. The Johnson brothers listened, their hearts hardening with each story of neighbors beaten or families driven from their land. By the time they reached manhood, they had made a vow spoken only to one another beneath the oak where their father had died. Never again would they be taken without a fight. Never again would they watch silently as blood stained the earth. If the world insisted on blood, then blood it would have. The historian, who pieced together these fragments from brittle papers and fragile testimonies, felt as though the photograph had begun to breathe. The men staring out of its frame were no longer strangers. They were boys who had watched their father hang and buried their mother alone. They were children shaped in fire, who had grown into men with rifles in their hands and a message carved into the wood, a torch burning, a vow of vengeance. As he read further into the county records, the pattern became clearer. references to 3 young black men working odd jobs, to fights in taverns where one of them had broken a white man's jaw, to whispers of a family cursed by violence. Their names appeared like ghosts in the margins of history, never given the dignity of full stories but impossible to erase. They had lived in blood, and it had marked them forever. The photograph, he now realized, was not a beginning but a culmination. It was the proof of what those boys had become, forged by the memory of their father's death and the weight of a world determined to crush them. And if this was only the first step in their story, then what followed would be darker still. The Johnson brothers had grown to manhood with the memory of their father swaying from a rope and their mother fading into the earth. The pain of that loss was not something that dulled with time. It sharpened, pressing into their souls like the edge of a blade. Solomon, the eldest, wore it on his body, every muscle hardened through years of hauling timber and plowing fields for other men who never looked him in the eye. David carried it in his silence, his gaze always scanning the horizon, his hands restless until they held a rifle. Caleb, youngest and most haunted, carried it deep inside, a smoldering anger that colored every word he spoke and every breath he took. They were bound not only by blood but by an oath unspoken, the unshakable conviction that they would never again live as helpless witnesses to injustice. Life, after their mother's death, was a grind of hunger and humiliation. They hired themselves out to those who would pay, chopping wood, repairing fences, skinning deer for hunters who despised them but needed their skills. At times, they were cheated of wages. At times, they were driven off by threats. But always they returned together, silent and grim, knowing that survival was its own kind of defiance. Yet, even as they toiled, the county around them grew darker. The years following the war were supposed to be years of freedom, but instead they became years of terror. Men in hoods rode by night, their laughter cold and cruel as houses burned. Women screamed in the fields, children clutched their mothers as torches lit the sky. The law, when it came at all, came not as protector, but as executioner. The brothers could not ignore it. Too many nights they saw the glow of fire on the hills. Too many mornings they walked past charred ruins where neighbors had once lived. Fear clung to every corner of their community. But alongside fear there was also a rising determination. In whispers at church gatherings, in furtive conversations behind barns, talk grew of men who refused to bow their heads, men who gathered in the dark not to flee but to fight. The Johnson brothers listened. They were not men of speeches, but they understood the language of action. It began quietly. Solomon forged connections with other laborers, men who had also lost fathers or brothers to the noose. David began to meet hunters in the woods, testing his skill with theirs, measuring their willingness to stand when danger came. Caleb, with his restless energy, sought out those whose anger burned as hot as his own. Slowly, a circle formed. They met under the cover of night, in the groves where no lantern light could be seen, speaking in low voices, watching the shadows as if expecting the enemy to step out at any moment. Their meetings were not filled with rhetoric. They were filled with resolve. Each man swore that if their people were attacked, they would answer with steel and fire. They would not wait for the law that never came. They would be their own law. To seal their oath, they needed a mark, something to remind them of what they had promised and to strike fear into those who would harm them. Caleb, who had watched their father choke beneath the torchlight of grinning men, suggested the symbol. A burning torch, a flame that could not be extinguished. It would stand for vengeance, but also for memory, a light that carried their father's name into every act they undertook. Solomon, with his rough hands, carved the first torch into the stock of his rifle. The scrape of the blade against wood was harsh, deliberate, and when it was done, the mark seemed to glow even in the dim light of the fire. One by one, the others followed, etching the same torch into their weapons, branding themselves with the symbol of their oath. They were no longer simply brothers. They were the heart of a secret brotherhood, men bound to one another by blood, pain, and purpose. The training began soon after. They gathered in the woods, practicing in silence. David's sharp eye guided the others as they fired at targets nailed to trees, his voice calm and steady as he corrected their aim. Solomon drilled them in discipline, teaching them to hold steady under pressure, to move as one rather than scatter like frightened prey. Caleb pushed them further, urging them into the marshes at night, testing their endurance, insisting that fear had no place in their hearts. The woods echoed with the crack of rifles, the thud of blades against wood, the muffled grunts of men learning to fight as though their lives depended on it. In the community, whispers began to circulate. Families who had lost sons to night riders spoke quietly of protectors who moved unseen. Women crossing fields after dark claimed to have heard footsteps in the woods, not threatening but watchful, as if unseen guardians followed their path. No one spoke the Johnson name aloud, but all knew that somewhere men had risen who refused to accept helplessness. The very idea brought comfort to some and terror to others. White farmers muttered about strange happenings, of men being watched from the tree line, of cattle stolen back from those who had taken them by force. Rumors spread of figures appearing in the dark, rifles glinting, vanishing before pursuit could follow. To the fearful, they became shadows, phantoms who answered violence with violence. To the hopeful, they became symbols of resistance, proof that blood could indeed be answered with blood. The brothers did not seek glory. Each night they returned to their cabin with their weapons, eating in silence, their eyes haunted by memories of what they had seen and done. Yet, with each passing week, their resolve hardened. They knew that the day would come when they would face not rumors or whispers, but open confrontation. The torch symbol burned brighter in their minds, and the words scrawled later on the back of that old photograph, blood for blood, were already etched into their hearts. The historian, tracing their story through brittle scraps of testimony, felt the gravity of this transformation. He could almost hear the voices of those night gatherings, the sound of blades carving wood, the soft murmur of oaths taken by firelight. The photograph was no longer just an image of three men with rifles. It was the culmination of years of grief and fury that had forged them into more than survivors. They were the beginning of something darker and more formidable, a brotherhood that lived in the shadows, waiting for the moment when they would step into blood and history alike. The transformation from whispers in the dark to a force that others would come to fear did not happen overnight. It brewed slowly, like a storm building beyond the horizon, gathering strength in the unseen places until the day it finally broke. For the Johnson brothers, that storm broke on a sweltering summer night when the cries of a neighbor reached them through the heavy air, cries laced with terror and fire. It was a night when fear turned into action, when oaths whispered beneath trees became carved into flesh and earth alike. It was a night of the first blood. The brothers had heard rumors for weeks. A family of freedmen who lived 2 miles across the ridge had been harassed repeatedly. Cattle were driven off, fences destroyed, their eldest son beaten nearly to death on the road. Everyone in the community knew what it meant. Such acts were warnings, preludes to something worse. The riders and hoods did not act without purpose. They meant to drive the family away, to seize their land, to remind every black man in the county that freedom was a fragile dream. And so, when Solomon, David, and Caleb heard the shouts and saw the orange glow against the night sky, they knew what was happening without a word spoken between them. The three of them moved swiftly, their rifles in hand, their hearts pounding but steady. They had drilled for this moment, though they had not known when it would come. The torchlight flickered above the trees as they approached, shadows of mounted men circling the cabin where the family cowered inside. Flames licked at the dry wood of the porch, and the riders shouted curses, laughing as the terrified cries of women rose from within. It was a scene the brothers had witnessed too many times as children. Powerless then, but not now. Solomon signaled with a nod, his jaw clenched. David slipped to the left, his rifle cradled close, moving with the silent grace of a hunter. Caleb, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury, stayed close to Solomon. They crouched in the darkness of the trees, watching the mob. There were 8 men, their faces hidden behind rough cloth masks, their bodies draped in makeshift white robes meant to terrify. They carried torches and pistols, their laughter cutting through the night as if the suffering before them were sport. The first shot cracked through the air before the riders realized they were not alone. David's bullet struck true, tearing through the chest of the man holding a torch near the cabin door. He fell backward, the fire spilling across the dirt, and his companions spun in shock. Before they could react, Solomon rose from the shadows, his rifle booming. Another man dropped, his mask slipping to reveal wide eyes and a mouth frozen in surprise. Caleb shouted, his voice raw, and fired wildly, the bullet slamming into a rider's shoulder. The horse reared, screaming, and threw its rider into the dust. Chaos erupted. The mob scattered, some fumbling for their weapons, others kicking their horses into frantic gallops. But the Johnsons were relentless. They moved with a fury honed in years of loss, every shot carrying the weight of their father's death and their mother's grief. Another rider fell, clutching his side, his blood staining the white of his robe. The others cursed and screamed, firing blindly into the trees, but the brothers had vanished into darkness before striking again. The air filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder, the ground with groans of the wounded. The fight lasted minutes, though to those who lived it, it stretched into eternity. When the echoes of gunfire faded, 3 men lay dead in the dirt. 2 more writhed in agony, and the survivors fled into the night, their shouts fading into the distance. The cabin still stood, its walls scorched but unbroken. Inside, the family clutched one another, trembling, not yet understanding what had transpired outside their door. The brothers stood together in the aftermath, their chests heaving, their rifles still smoking. Caleb stared at the lifeless body nearest him, the mask twisted grotesquely, the torch still burning faintly in his dead hand. He felt both exhilaration and dread. This was the first time he had spilled a man's blood, and it seared itself into him. He thought of his father, of the oak tree and the rope, and a fierce satisfaction surged through him. Yet beneath it lingered a whisper of something darker, a question he could not yet form. Solomon clapped his shoulder, his voice low but steady. They had done what they had sworn to do. Before they vanished back into the night, Solomon drew his knife and crouched beside the fallen. With deliberate strokes he carved into the wood of the cabin door the mark of the torch engulfed in flame. It was their signature, their warning, their vow made visible. Blood had been answered with blood, and the county would know it. News spread swiftly, carried on the lips of those who had lived in fear too long. Some spoke of angels of vengeance, shadows who struck against the riders who tormented them. Others whispered in awe of men who dared to stand where others bowed. But among the white farmers and merchants, the story grew into something monstrous. Newspapers spoke of savages, of lawless freedmen who dared raise their hands against decent men. The dead were painted as martyrs of order, while the brothers were branded murderers. Rewards were whispered, names cursed in anger, though none dared speak them openly. For the Johnson brothers there was no turning back. The night of fire and gunpowder had sealed their path. They had chosen to meet hatred with steel, and in doing so, they had stepped into a world from which there could be no retreat. The torch carved into the cabin would not fade, nor would the memory of the dead at their feet. They were no longer just sons of Isaac and Ruth Johnson. They were avengers, protectors, and executioners in equal measure. Their brotherhood had been baptized in blood. As the historian pieced the fragments together, reports of the burned robes found in ditches, of wounded men carried to neighboring farms, of whispers in the black community of unseen defenders. He realized that the photograph he had found had captured not hunters, not farmers, but men who had crossed the line into legend. Their eyes in the picture were not the eyes of men untested. They were the eyes of those who had taken lives, who had seen blood spilled and carved their oath into the world with fire and lead. The stain at their feet in the image was no accident. It was memory. The county would never be the same after that night. Fear changed hands, if only for a moment, and the balance of power shifted on a tide of blood. The Johnson brothers had struck, and the world had learned that they would not cower in silence. From that night forward, every rider who carried a torch into the darkness would wonder if shadows waited to answer with rifles. And for the brothers themselves, the taste of vengeance was both triumph and curse. They had proven their oath true, but they had also opened the door to a cycle that would demand more, again and again, until nothing remained but ashes and ghosts. The fire at the neighbor's cabin did not end with the retreat of masked men and the blood that soaked into the dirt outside its walls. It began something that could not be undone, a current that dragged the Johnson brothers and all who lived around them into deeper waters of violence. In the days that followed, silence hung over the ridge like a shroud. White families buried their dead and ceremonies filled with speeches about law, order, and the sanctity of their community. Black families whispered prayers of gratitude and terror, unsure if the men who had come to their defense were a blessing or the beginning of even greater ruin. The Johnson brothers returned to their cabin, their faces grim, their hands steady, but they knew the world had shifted. For the first time since their father's lynching, they had not only survived, but struck back. And in that act, they had become something their enemies had never imagined, a force that could no longer be ignored. The retaliation did not come at once, but it came with certainty. Riders gathered in greater numbers now, no longer content to terrorize scattered farms, but determined to hunt. They whispered the name Johnson with venom, even if few dared to speak it aloud in public. In the sheriff's office, reports of armed Negroes filled the dusty ledger, each complaint more heated than the last. Newspapers printed inflammatory stories about marauders in the hills, painting them as savages who attacked without provocation. Rewards were whispered, rumors circulated, but still no man had the courage to ride openly against the brothers. Fear had entered their ranks like a splinter, small but festering. For Solomon, David, and Caleb, the knowledge of that fear was intoxicating, but it was also heavy. The night after the attack, Solomon sat at their table, oil lamp flickering across his face, and said they could not stop now. If they returned to silence, the riders would regain their confidence, and the killings would continue. They had drawn blood, carved their torch into wood, and declared themselves. To fall back was to invite annihilation. David nodded, his silence speaking louder than words. Caleb, eyes burning with restless fire, said only that he wanted more. He wanted every man who had raised a torch against their people to fall and choke on his own blood. Thus began the war in the shadows. The Johnson brothers did not wait for enemies to come to them. They became hunters, moving silently across the hills and woods, following the faintest traces of hoof prints, listening at tavern doors, gathering whispers in the night. When word reached them of a planned raid, they struck first. Horses were found riderless, their saddles soaked in blood. Wagons meant to carry stolen goods were left abandoned on the road, wheels broken, their owners nowhere to be seen but for the pools of red in the dust. The symbol of the torch began to appear again and again, carved into trees, burned into doors, scratched onto rocks near the places where blood had been spilled. It became a calling card, both feared and revered. White families spat the word torchbearers like a curse, while black families murmured it as if it were protection. The Johnsons had become legends in their own lifetimes, though the price of that legend grew heavier with each passing week. There was no law to protect them, but there was also no law they could rely upon to restrain them. Each attack made them harder, more relentless. At first, their actions were measured, aimed at those they knew to be guilty of violence. But the lines blurred quickly. A man who spoke too loudly in the tavern of what he would do to the uppity freedmen was found beaten senseless by the roadside. A horse thief, suspected of riding with a hooded gang, disappeared into the marshes. His body never recovered. Families of known raiders woke to find their barns aflame, their livestock driven into the night. The Johnson brothers did not spare those who profited from hatred, even indirectly. For them, silence or complicity was enough to warrant punishment. David struggled the most with what they were becoming. He still remembered the way his father had stood tall even as the rope tightened, refusing to beg. He wondered if by becoming executioners they were honoring his memory or corrupting it. But Solomon silenced his doubts with the certainty of a man who had long since buried his conscience beneath duty. "We are alive," he told his brother one night as they sat cleaning rifles in the glow of the fire. "That is enough." Caleb did not struggle at all. The youngest brother had embraced the darkness fully, his laughter sharp and unnerving as he recalled the look on a dying man's face. For him, vengeance was not only justice but sustenance. The county became a place of whispers and fear. White farmers no longer rode alone after dusk. Taverns emptied early, men clutching pistols as they hurried home. The sheriff wrote letters begging for reinforcements from the state, but no one came. To ride against the Johnsons was to risk never returning, and yet the violence did not stop. It only grew more desperate. For every barn the brothers burned, another cabin of freedmen was set aflame by vengeful riders. For every corpse left with the torch symbol carved nearby, another black family fled in terror, abandoning their land and possessions. The war in the shadows was not a single battle, but a tide, surging back and forth, drowning the innocent along with the guilty. The brothers felt it too. Their nights were filled with gunpowder and smoke, their days with exhaustion. They rarely spoke now except to plan their next move. The laughter that had once filled their cabin in fleeting moments of peace was gone. In its place was silence, broken only by the scraping of blades being sharpened, the loading of cartridges, the restless shifting of men who no longer knew where vengeance ended and survival began. Yet, in the eyes of their community, they remained protectors. Families whispered thanks to them in church, leaving food at their doorstep, though few dared to linger for fear of being marked as allies. Children looked at them with awe, even as their mothers pulled them away, muttering prayers. The brothers carried the weight of those expectations as heavily as they carried their rifles. To stop now would mean betraying everyone who believed in them, but to continue was to drown further in blood. The historian, tracing these events through crumbling newspapers and faded court records, saw the pattern clearly. Mentions of nighttime killings appeared with regularity, always followed by denials from officials who insisted no such groups existed. Reports of burned barns, missing men, and mutilated bodies filled the margins of local gossip, never officially recorded but passed down in family stories. And again, the same symbol emerged: the torch, flame eternal, carved into the fabric of the county like a scar. The photograph he had found now seemed even heavier with meaning. The faces staring back from the image were not merely solemn, they were hardened, shaped by nights of fire and vengeance. The dark stain at their feet spoke not of one night but of many, the cumulative weight of blood spilled in secret wars that official history refused to acknowledge. The torch on the rifle stock was no simple carving. It was the emblem of a war fought in silence, of justice and cruelty entwined until neither could be told apart. By the winter of 1871, the county was gripped by terror, each family, black or white, living with the knowledge that shadows might strike at any time. For the Johnson brothers, there was no longer any difference between defending their people and destroying their enemies. They had become both sword and shield, wielded by their own rage. And though they could not yet see it, the storm they had unleashed was gathering toward a final reckoning, one from which not all of them would return. By the close of 1871, the county was a cauldron, its nights marked by fire and its days heavy with dread. Every burned barn and every mutilated body had become part of a tally no ledger could contain, debts measured not in money but in blood. The Johnson brothers had grown gaunt, their eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, their hands blistered from the constant cycle of loading, firing, sharpening, and striking. The war in the shadows had consumed them so thoroughly that they no longer remembered what it meant to live without fear. They were not merely men anymore. They were specters to their enemies, and to their neighbors they were both guardians and omens of ruin. Each sunrise brought fresh rumors of reprisals, and each sunset promised more vengeance. No one could mistake it any longer. A reckoning was inevitable. The decision to end the Johnsons came not from a single man, but from a gathering of those who felt their world slipping away. In taverns filled with smoke and whiskey, in barns where men sharpened scythes into crude weapons, the talk grew louder. The riders who had once laughed as they rode through Freedman's Fields no longer laughed. They muttered instead, their bravado cracked by the fear of shadows that watched them from tree lines. The Johnsons had to be rooted out, destroyed utterly, for only then could the county believe itself safe again. By the turn of the year, plans had taken shape. A force of dozens would be raised, more than enough, they believed, to crush 3 brothers and whatever handful of followers still clung to them. The bait was chosen carefully. Word was spread that a raid would be staged near the old mill by the river, a place that had once ground corn for half the county, but now stood abandoned, its timbers sagging, its wheel broken. The mill had become a landmark of decay, a fitting stage for the trap they envisioned. Rumors reached the brothers quickly, as their enemies knew they would. Solomon heard it first from a neighbor who spoke with fear in his eyes. David confirmed it when whispers reached him through a preacher's wife who had overheard men boasting of the ambush. Caleb needed no persuasion. He had been waiting for such a confrontation, his hunger for battle growing more fevered with each night they spent hunted. To him, the idea of riding into danger was not madness, but destiny. The night of the battle dawned heavy with mist, the air damp and bitter. The brothers prepared in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Solomon checked and rechecked his rifle, his lips moving in a prayer he did not speak aloud. David polished his knife until it gleamed in the lamplight, then slipped it into his belt with steady hands. Caleb paced like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, his eyes alight with the fever of expectation. They knew this could be their end, but none voiced it. To do so would be to surrender before the fight had even begun. When they reached the mill, the silence struck them first. It was too complete, the hush of a place holding its breath. The old timbers loomed against the pale moonlight, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. For a moment, it seemed empty, but the brothers knew better. They felt the weight of unseen eyes, the tightening coil of danger. Then came the first shout, the crack of a branch beneath a boot, and the trap was sprung. Dozens of men burst from the trees, their torches flaring, their weapons raised. The clearing erupted in chaos. Gunfire roared, smoke choking the air, the cries of men and horses blending into a cacophony of violence. Solomon bellowed orders, his deep voice cutting through the din as he fired with ruthless precision. David moved like a wraith, his shots measured, each one finding its mark. Caleb screamed as he charged, his rifle blasting, his knife flashing as he fell upon the nearest rider with the ferocity of a man possessed. The mill became a furnace of death. Bullets punched into the rotting wood, splinters flying like daggers. Torches set the dry grass ablaze, flames licking at the timbers until the old structure groaned and creaked. Men fell on both sides, their screams torn from their throats as steel met flesh, as fire devoured the air around them. The brothers fought as if guided by something beyond mortal strength, every movement born of years of rage. But the numbers against them were crushing. Solomon was the first to fall. He had held the line at the entrance of the mill, his broad frame shielding his brothers as he fired again and again. When a bullet tore through his chest, he staggered but did not collapse. He swung his rifle like a club, felling one man, then another, his roar shaking the rafters. Only when his strength failed at last did he sink to his knees, blood soaking his shirt, his eyes blazing with defiance until the final breath left him. David saw him fall and felt the ground tilt beneath him, but he forced himself to remain steady, his rifle never wavering. Caleb was madness incarnate. With Solomon's fall, he threw himself deeper into the melee, his knife carving arcs of crimson through the smoky air. He fought like a man already dead, heedless of bullets that grazed his skin, of blows that split his flesh. He laughed even as his body was torn, a terrible, unearthly sound that unnerved those who faced him. When at last a shot struck deep into his side, he staggered but did not stop. He dragged the man who had fired it to the ground, plunging his blade again and again until his strength failed. Collapsing beside the corpse, Caleb smeared his own blood across the wall of the mill, dragging the shape of their torch into the scorched wood before his hand fell limp. David alone remained standing, his chest tight with grief, his body trembling with exhaustion. He saw his brothers lying in pools of blood, saw the flames climbing higher, and knew the battle was lost. Yet he refused to surrender. Gathering what strength remained, he fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his knife and slashed his way through the press of enemies. He fought not for victory, but for escape, for the chance to carry their story beyond this night. With blood on his hands and fire at his back, he slipped into the trees, the darkness swallowing him whole. When the flames consumed the mill, those who survived on the other side claimed victory. They told tales of savage men finally brought low, of order restored to the county. But the mark Caleb had left remained, blackened into the wall of the ruined mill. Even the fire could not erase it. Those who saw it whispered in fear. The torch still burned, even in death. For the community that had looked to the Johnson brothers, their loss was devastating. Families wept in silence, their protectors gone, their vengeance incomplete. Yet in their grief was also pride. The brothers had not gone quietly. They had stood, they had fought, and they had carved their defiance into the bones of the county. To the white farmers, the tale was one of triumph, proof that the old order could still assert itself. But in the hush of black churches, in the murmurs of children who would one day tell the story again, the Johnsons became something else entirely. They were martyrs, their blood a seed that could not be trampled. The historian, who pieced these events together from scraps of testimony and fragments of record, could feel the heat of that night even through the brittle pages. The photograph he had found, the image of 3 men standing stiff and unyielding, now bore its full weight. Those faces were not merely solemn. They were already carrying the shadow of that final night, already marked by the knowledge that their path would end in fire and blood. The stain at their feet, once a mystery, seemed now an omen of the mill, where their lives were poured out into the soil. The torch on their rifles was not just a carving, it was prophecy fulfilled. The last battle had ended, but its echoes did not fade. They whispered through the generations, carried in stories, half remembered and half feared, until the photograph surfaced again in a dusty box more than a century later. And still the torch burned. The last battle at the old mill had long ago burned itself into silence, its ashes scattered, its blood dried into the soil, but time could not erase the mark the Johnson brothers left behind. The torch Caleb had dragged into the wall with his dying hand was gone now, consumed by rot and weather, yet it lived in whispers and in the photograph that had lain hidden for more than a century. To the historian who had first uncovered that image in a forgotten box, the story had become more than research. It was obsession, a current that pulled him deeper with every discovery until he felt himself standing in the smoke of that night, hearing the crack of rifles and the cries of dying men. The photograph lay before him now, encased in a protective sleeve, yet no barrier could soften the force of the gazes staring out from its faded surface. He saw Solomon, steady and broad, the father's strength etched into his posture. He saw David, the watchful hunter, silence heavy in his eyes. He saw Caleb, the youngest, with that look of fierce defiance, a spark already burning into fire. At their feet, the dark smear seemed to pulse with its own life, a reminder of all that had been lost and all that had been taken. And on the stock of the rifle, that torch, still glimmering faintly in the black and white grain, an emblem of vengeance and memory that no century of dust could erase. The historian had pieced together their journey from fragments that most would have discarded as irrelevant. He had traced names through court records, where the Johnsons appeared only as troublemakers, suspected in disappearances the authorities could not explain. He had followed their shadows through newspaper articles that spoke of lawless freedmen, their tone dripping with disdain, each word bent to shape a narrative that cast the dead as innocent and the living as monsters. Yet, the deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. The Johnson brothers had not been lawless. They had been the law of necessity in a world where the official law was a weapon against them. He thought of the old mill, its ruins still standing, a place he had visited once on a gray afternoon while the story consumed him. The timbers sagged, vines twisting up through the stone foundation. The wheel collapsed into the river. No plaque marked the spot, no sign told what had happened there. To the world, it was nothing but decay. Yet, when he stood among the ruins, he swore he could still smell smoke, still hear the echo of rifles. It was there, beneath his feet, the history that no one had written, but that everyone had felt. The more he studied the photograph, the more he understood it as more than a record of 3 men. It was a confession, and it was a monument. These men had chosen to stand before a camera at a time when photographs were rare, costly, deliberate. They had chosen to be remembered not as laborers or supplicants, but as warriors. Their faces told the truth that official records denied, that black men had not been merely victims in those years after the war, but fighters, defenders, avengers who carved their resistance into the night with fire and steel. The photograph was not meant to comfort. It was meant to haunt. And it did haunt. To the historian, the weight of it pressed upon him until he dreamed of those 3 figures, imagined their voices carried down through generations. He thought of the children they had defended, the families who whispered thanks in church pews, the widows who wept for them when they did not return from the mill. He thought, too, of the enemies who cursed their names, who told their sons that the Johnsons had been devils. The truth lived between those stories, dark and unyielding, as complex as the men themselves. When he presented his findings at the university, the room fell into heavy silence. Students leaned forward, their pens forgotten, as he showed the photograph on the screen. He recounted the lynching of Isaac Johnson, the death of Ruth, the vow made beneath the oak tree, the torch carved into the rifles, the first blood spilled at the cabin, the war in the shadows, and finally the inferno at the mill. He spoke not as a detached scholar, but as a man who had followed ghosts into their graves. The students listened with wide eyes, some with tears, others with clenched jaws. For many, it was the first time they had heard such a story. The first time they had been told that resistance had not only existed, but had been fierce, bloody, and unforgettable. Outside of the classroom, the reaction was more complicated. Some colleagues praised his work as groundbreaking, as vital to the understanding of Reconstruction. Others dismissed it, arguing that his reliance on oral histories and fragmentary records made it too speculative. There were those who preferred the old stories, the sanitized narratives that painted the years after the war as a failed experiment in freedom, doomed by chaos and incompetence. To them, the Johnson brothers did not fit, for their existence suggested not chaos, but a deliberate struggle for dignity, one that could not be erased no matter how many barns were burned or how many bodies swung from trees. The historian knew that the photograph alone could not prove every detail he had unearthed, but it did not need to. The power of the image was not in its ability to verify dates and names, but in its ability to speak across time. Those three men had stared into the lens, knowing full well that their lives might be extinguished, that their story might be buried in silence. Yet they had chosen to leave a fragment of themselves behind, a message scrawled on the back in fading ink. Blood for blood. And now, more than a century later, that message had been read. He often returned to the archive late at night when the halls of the university were empty and the world outside was still. He would sit with the photograph, letting the silence gather around him, and he would imagine what it must have felt like for the Johnson brothers to stand where they had stood. He thought of Solomon, strong and steady until the end, falling with his rifle still in his hands. He thought of Caleb, carving the torch into the mill with his dying blood. He thought of David, the survivor, slipping into the trees with the weight of his family's legacy on his shoulders. Somewhere, perhaps, David had lived to old age, his story never told, his name forgotten. Or perhaps he had perished soon after, his body left in some shallow grave. The photograph gave no answers. It only gave questions that gnawed at the mind and refused to fade. In the end, the historian understood that history was not only about documents and dates. It was about memory, about the fragments left behind by those who had no voice in the official record. The Johnson brothers had been erased from the ledgers, but they had carved themselves into the conscience of the land. Their story was not neat, not simple. It was filled with blood and vengeance, with blurred lines between justice and cruelty. But it was real, and it demanded to be told. He thought often of the last words written on the back of the photograph. Blood for blood. To some, it was a threat. To others, a promise. To him, it was a testament to lives lived fiercely in the face of unrelenting hate. The torch still burned, not in wood or in fire, but in the recognition that even in the darkest times, there were those who refused to bow. When he finally placed the photograph into its archival box, sealing it against time once more, he felt the weight of the past settle upon him. He knew that what he had uncovered was only a fragment of a larger truth, one of countless hidden stories waiting in forgotten drawers and unmarked graves. The Johnson brothers were gone, their bones long turned to dust, but through the photograph they had spoken across the years. And in that speech there was a question, one that lingered long after the box was closed and the lights switched off. What hidden stories of loyalty, defiance, and justice still lay buried in the shadows, waiting for someone to listen? The historian walked out into the night, the cool air brushing his face, the stars sharp above him. Somewhere, beyond the reach of time, he imagined Solomon, David, and Caleb still standing together, rifles in hand, gazes unyielding. The torch burned on, its flame unseen yet unextinguished, carried forward by the telling of their story. The photograph had not been silent after all. It had simply waited, biding its time, until the world was ready to hear. If this story gripped you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next unbelievable history uncovered. Check out our other shocking videos waiting for you right now, and don't forget to share this one with your friends. You never know who else will be stunned by what was revealed.